right, let's get into today's top story and talk about these 14 days, because we are watching the United States collapse right in front of our eyes. And it's all part of a plan to deindustrialize the Western world. So, yeah, the United States is going to feel the brunt of this. But heck, it's Europe. We're seeing the trouble, of course, recession hitting in Germany, in Italy. We see already what's happening in the United Kingdom. A few weeks ago, we covered the energy crisis that's about to destroy the United States. At the time, it was only 25 days left. And this was from the White House, by the way. This came from economic advisor Brian Deese, who said, we have about 25 days left of reserve energy in our diesel supply. That's it. It's about to run out. That was 11 days ago. Nothing's changed. Nothing has changed. In fact, it's only gotten worse. And why is the mainstream media, by the way, totally ignoring the story? Totally ignoring
beyond that. In fact, the headlines, if you just sort of do your own cursory search around it, are, it is about, 14 days, but it's okay. It's not going to run out. There's nothing to worry about. That is the active headline narrative that you find when you just do any sort of mainstream Google News search or CNN search.
Well, because they're all in the tank. We know they're all in the tank for them and this administration. And of course, you're going to see that when we talk about the Intercept story a little bit later in the DHS the leaks about how in cahoots they are to keep these guys in office in Washington. So, of course, you're not going to see any negative news right now about the Biden administration or Democrats. I mean, look how they bent over backwards to try to tell you that Paul Pelosi was attacked by a MAGA supporter. How ridiculous that was. So we now know how ridiculous all of this is.
Abe in the chat wants to know, where's Ukraine getting the diesel to run weapons?
Question.
Because a lot of that machinery also runs on diesel. That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. We don't have answers.
We don't. Well, I think we do have answers.
We can guess.
We can guess where that diesel fuel is coming from and how the military-industrial complex can carry on wars around the world with all of the fuel that they need to provide for their tanks and everything else. But Americans and normal people throughout Europe are going to suffer. So again, nothing has changed. The Biden administration hasn't done anything different than it said 11 days ago when it told us about this shortage. In fact, it's only gotten worse. We'll have more on that specifically in a second on how it's gotten worse. Now, you remember, of course, over the summer, President Biden went to Saudi Arabia. He did the big fist bump with the Saudi prince, and he had one job. Right? We say that you have one job. You have one job. That job is that you're going there specifically to kiss their ring and ask for more oil, for them to produce more oil. That's the only reason you're going there. That's it. There's no other reason. And he failed on that. And guess what? Not only did the Saudis not agree to more production, in fact, they did the opposite and they cut production. But then, of course, the Biden administration said, we're consequences, right? You cut oil, now there's consequences for you.
Well, to be fair, it wasn't just Saudi Arabia that voted for that oil production cut. It was all OPEC plus nations. They collectively.
They are the leader.
Yes, but it got a majority vote. Nobody dissented.
Yeah. So he's there basically, hey, you're the leader here. Push OPEC nations, push Venezuela, push the other members of OPEC to make these production increases, right? Because we're going to be suffering. We didn't plan ahead, so we need your help in all of this. So anyway, we vow a payback. We also learned that the Biden administration asked them to delay the cutting of the oil production. This was like the icing on the cake, right? They were asked to delay the cutting of oil production by 1 month until after the U.S. midterm elections, which to me, that is just... Come on. That's the biggest.
It's dirty.
We know it's going to be bad, but just can you let us get through the midterm election so it doesn't screw us up? We don't want to lose this election.
This is a manipulation of things for political gain. And so if you think about asking someone for a favor that will not harm you in the election, how much different is that for what Michael Cohen went to jail for?
Good point.
Michael Cohen went to jail to hide the Stormy Daniels affair,
right?
Which they say was election interference. So isn't this also election interference?
Right. You're asking a foreign government to literally...
To give you a political favor.
Right. Before the midterms. And not just Saudi Arabia, as you pointed out, all of these other members of the OPEC countries. Arguably maybe even worse than what Michael Cohen did. But no one's going to bring him up on this.
Well, I just did. I don't expect it to go much further than what I just said.
So Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House specimen,
The White House press secretary. Don't say that.
The White House press secretary, who is just a mouthpiece of the regime, went on CNN with Wolf Blitzer. And because, Biden had one job when he went to Saudi Arabia. It was to increase production of oil to help the United States. That's the only reason we paid his taxpayer dollars to fly there. So she lies right to our face when Wolf Blitzer asks her some tough questions about that very trip. Watch.
I'm anxious to get your thoughts on this New York Times report that U.S. officials thought they had a deal with the Saudis before the president went to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia for his meeting with the Crown Prince. But they thought they had a deal on oil supplies and oil, price of oil, but that the Saudis backed out of that deal. What can you tell us about
So
that?
we have been very clear about how we believe parts of that report was mischaracterized, and there has been some changes that have been made to that report. Look, we've also been clear that our trip, that the president's trip to the Middle East, was not about oil.
Was there an
Gas prices
understanding,
go
Karine,
down.
with the Saudis that the Saudis then backed away from?
Again, the trip was not about oil.
You're just lying. You're lying. And, it's amazing to watch her sort of struggle when she doesn't have her notebook in front of her, too. And flicking the eyes, like, blinking so much. Like, what am I going to say here? What am I going to say? It's a total lie. The whole and President Biden told us before the trip that it was about increasing oil.
Yes, because otherwise he had intended to make Saudi Arabia a pariah.
A pariah. Yeah, which he said on the campaign trail. And by the way, speaking of the campaign trail, it reminded me of this moment because remember, these fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, crude oil, like the United States would cease to function as a nation if those things were eliminated or drawn down on specifically. Without it, societies collapse. We knew that this was coming. Biden told us during the campaign, during a debate with President Trump, and this was arguably one of the most important moments of these entire debates. Of course, didn't matter because he ended up, quote unquote, going on to take the White House anyway. But here's what exactly happened. Watch.
I have one final question.
Would he close down the oil industry?
It falls.
Would you close down the oil industry?
By the way, I would transition from the oil industry, yes.
Oh,
I will
that's
transition.
a big statement.
It is a big statement.
That's a big
because
statement.
I would stop.
Why would you do that?
Because the oil industry pollutes significantly.
I see.
Here's the deal. But
That's
you
a
can't
big
do
statement.
that. Well, if you let me finish the statement, because it has to be replaced by renewable energy over time. And I'd stop giving to the oil industry, I'd stop giving them federal subsidies. He won't give federal subsidies to the gas, to solar and wind.
Yeah.
Why are we giving it to oil industry?
We actually do give
All right.
it to solar and wind.
We
And
have
that's
one
maybe the
final
biggest
question.
statement in terms of business. That's the biggest statement.
Okay.
Because
We have
basically
one
what he's
final
saying
question,
is he is
Mr.
going to
President.
destroy the oil industry. Okay. Will you remember that, Texas? Will you
Okay.
remember that, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma?
Vice President Biden, let me.
I see that through such a different lens now, because when he just sort of blanketly says, well, because it pollutes, right? And he's like, that's a big statement. And he goes, yeah, I will quantify it. And he doesn't.
No, he doesn't quantify
Now,
it.
After all of this reading that I've been doing, I'm actually quite annoyed.
Yeah, I would be.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like I feel like such a fool for the way I watched that so many years ago.
Because people we all sort of think, oh yeah, fossil fuels, they pollute, right? And so you just say that as a blanket statement, and you're like, yeah, I guess when I'm driving behind a car and I suck in all that, okay, yeah, that's pollution. But what you don't understand is that all of your fossil fuels is being used to power all of those electric cars that you're giving all of these subsidies to. It's the whole hypocrite. It's absolute hypocrisy, top to bottom. But of course, that's exactly what happened. He telegraphed and he told us that. That was just one of many times he was telling us that he was going to shut down this industry and move us away from these things. And now it's much worse. So here's what we're facing as of this morning. So into some of the details now. The U.S. diesel shortage is worsening. The U.S. diesel shortage is worsening as distillate inventories crash to multi-year lows. U.S. refiners permanently shutting down some refining capacity at the start of the pandemic when the fuel demand plunged. Think about transportation, food production, the agricultural industries, electricity, consumer. So your electricity relies on diesel fuel, relies on fuel. Consumer industries, all of the transportation to get your food on the grocery stores, diesel fuel. CNBC is calling this the perfect storm because diesel prices are up 33% for November and are expected to keep going.
In fact, look at this headline from CNBC just today. Diesel market is in a perfect storm as prices surge and supply dwindles ahead of winter. But check out this key takeaway that I circled, and I'm going to read it for you because I know that's too small. Diesel reserves have not been this low since 1951. And a ban on Russian products set for next year will intensify competition for that fuel. So next year, we have more bans coming, more sanctions. In fact, on February 5th, a ban on refined Russian products goes into effect. So you thought it was already as bad as it could get. It's not. It's getting worse. And in case you might not have noticed, there is kind of a bigger need for fuel in the year 2022 than there was in the year 1951 when we had this same level of supply. Check out this source. Now our population has more than doubled. Inventory is about the same, and demand is, 4 times as much. But, it was 1.02 million in 1951. Now it's 4.2 million. But back in 1951, when we had this same level of inventory, or roughly the same level of inventory, we had 102 days supply because the demand was so much lower. So, okay, we're going to burn right through that, right? Speaking of transportation, though, there is actually another railway strike that may be on the horizon because 2 unions voted down the compromise that President Biden proposed last September. So not only could there not be diesel fuel, there also could not be railroads running to deliver all of your goods. This would not happen before the midterm elections, but it's coming, and the media is keeping it very quiet because they don't want you to think that this might be a sign of a worsening economy under Democratic control of Congress. But that is exactly what's happening. They're saying that U.S. refineries are operating on 102% right now. So not just 100%, they're operating at 102%. So someone's getting whipped to work faster. And even still, we can't get diesel. We can't get it. So the question is, can we get it from overseas? No, we cannot, because of something called the Jones Act. The Jones Act is also known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, prohibits a foreign vessel from transporting all goods between 2 U.S. ports. It requires all cargo transported between U.S. ports be carried on ships that are U.S. flagged and built, and mostly owned and crewed by Americans. So according to Marine Traffic, the 55 Jones Act tankers are all in use right now. There's only 55. When you think about it, that's not enough.
Right.
One way to add more supply is for the Department of Homeland Security to temporarily waive the act for foreign vessels. If they did that, check out these numbers, because it's actually a lot more expensive to use U.S. tankers than it would be to use a foreign-built tanker. For instance, right now, a Jones Act tanker carrying 300,000 barrels of diesel from Houston to Boston costs approximately 16 cents per gallon. If we waive the Jones Act, a foreign flag tanker carrying the same amount of fuel and heading to the identical location is estimated to cost half, 8 cents per gallon. That translates into a $1 million savings per tanker. That's one of the reasons why energy traders favor using foreign flag tankers versus Jones Act tanker.
And these ships, of course, use diesel on top. So they're transporting diesel, using diesel,
and they don't have enough.
Someone in the chat said, "Do you think that this will come to fruition?" You guys talk about this. I hope it doesn't. The reason we're doing it is so that people don't die. The reason we're doing this story is, by the way, we were the only news organization covering this story with our size audience. And then I think 48 hours later or 24 hours later, I saw it on Fox, and Tucker covered the story. So awesome for him for covering the story. So between our show and that show, really the only shows covering this story on a large scale. And that's why we're doing it, so that people pay attention. If there's any members of Washington actually watching our show, I hear from congressmen who write to me, so they're watching. You can make a change. You can force change on this, because people are going to die. They're not going to be able to afford to keep on their heat in their house. Yeah. Because first of all, there's not going to be any, or they're going to be charged an enormous amount of money. I've seen multiple reports from people in different parts of the country, specifically though in the Northeast, because that's where they're going to hit the hardest, where they're having to make a choice between, getting food or even like paying the rent and keeping the heat on.
Yes. Yeah. It's not just about, the sort of like dollar section at Target will be empty because you can't ship those things from China. This is much more serious than that. This is about no food, no fuel, no food.
Right. So it goes worse.
Well, and unfortunately, we've set this up, this whole economy up this way to where we're shipping food over to China and back. And so it's like a huge swath of our food comes from over there. So like we've just set up this system that's just destined to fail. It's completely based on fuel.
Well, that's why I said at the top, this is all about the deindustrialization of the West. Like, we want to take this stuff away from Americans' hands and out of Europeans' hands. This is all part of this plan by these globalists to drive us away from this, to speed the transition off of fossil fuels. Now, I see people in the chat sometimes say, and they're not fossil fuels. They're fuels, they're not fossil fuels. We colloquially call them fossil fuels. I mean, call them, I guess, whatever you want. They're not fossils anymore.
Right.
So, okay. Anyway, natural gas, crude oil, petroleum, stuff that's not solar and wind, I guess, is what we want to call them. I don't know what if anyone has a better name for them than
fossil fuels,
then, I guess come up with
Ancient
that.
captured sun energy. That's basically what it is.
Old ferns.
Ancient captured sun energy.
So what is the Biden administration even doing about this in Congress? I mean, here's an answer from the White House's most condescending lackey, John Kirby. I can't stand this guy. Watch his response to this question.
What are we doing to increase the supply of diesel, given that the Energy Information Administration said as of October 14th, the U.S. only had about a 25-day supply? You have the Northeast and New York already rationing home heating oil. What are we doing to prepare for the winter and to ramp up supply of diesel?
I'll take the question on the diesel because I just don't have the data on that in front of me. So let me take that and we'll get back to you on that. But writ large, the president has been working very, very hard to make sure that we're that not only are we ready for fluctuations that could come, and of course the prices are going down, and we think that's important, but that we are also doing what we can to help our European friends and partners who are also going to be facing a long, cold winter. We have doubled our commitment. The commitment he made in March for natural gas exports to Europe, we've doubled that commitment.
By the way, out of the kindness of our own hearts. So we blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, and now conveniently we're doubling our natural gas exports, out of the kindness of our hearts. By the way, we also quadrupled the price tag as well. So we're just so kind.
In terms of actual, getting things over there, getting natural gas over there. And we are working with foreign suppliers of natural gas and oil to see if we can't help our European partners diversify their own storage and supplies.
Okay. So we're doing everything we can for Europe right now. But can't answer the question at all. Like, do you feel any better about it? What are you doing here at home? Nothing. The president is working around the clock. He's working tirelessly to do what? To do what? Give us some specifics. He didn't give us one answer. Nothing there. The Biden administration actually granted, interestingly, more oil leases on federal land than any administration in U.S. history. So that sounds great, right? 3,500 permits the Biden administration handed out to oil companies. Trump only did 2,600. So on paper, the Biden administration likes to tout that number, though we've just given out so many more, right? So what's going on here? Sounds interesting, right? Well, something's not adding up then. All of these extra permits sound great. So why aren't the big 2 or big 3 oil companies in the United States using them? Chevron, Exxon, Shell, et cetera. Why aren't they using them? Well, more oil means cheaper fuel prices, right? When there's more supply, then there's less demand. And then, of course, that drives down prices and then profits are lower. And of course, as these big oil companies absolutely want to keep raking in profits, they don't want to have a cheaper cost of oil. They want these profits. Look at the record Q2 numbers for compared to last year. The dark line is this year compared to last year. Look at the numbers. Drastic for Exxon, Chevron, Shell, BP. Just crushing profits that they've had this year over last year. So Biden could give these leases to these major companies. And what he could do, though, is invite a lot of junior producers, smaller companies to come in, competition. So that's one thing you could do, right? Invite competition for these oil leases and where these companies might actually drill on them. But a lot of these big oil companies right now are just sitting on these leases. They're not actually doing anything with them. And of course, another big piece of the argument is a lot of these federal leases that the Biden administration has been giving out, there's no oil under the ground where they've given out these leases. So it's kind of a whole dog and pony show. I'm giving you the leases, but we're sitting on the leases, but there's no oil underneath where the ground of the leases you gave me. It's a whole charade. But it's all part of a dance that they're doing because these lobbyists in Washington pay them billions of dollars. I mean, they're there in Washington lobbying the heck out of the Biden administration, lobbying the heck out of Republicans and Democrats. They're all in cahoots with this.
But it's interesting because just on Monday, the Biden administration was addressing the record quarterly profits for all of these big oil companies, Exxon, BP, Chevron. And he's saying, I think it's time that we put higher taxes on your profits. And he said specifically, at a time of war, any company receiving historic windfall profits like this has a responsibility to act beyond the narrow self-interest of its executives and shareholders. And I had a viewer today write me quite rightly and point out, when did we declare war? Congress hasn't declared war.
We're in wartime, but I thought we were in peacetime. No, we're in wartime. I mean, I guess because, as the Washington Post is now reporting and confirming that we have American soldiers in Ukraine.
Okay, then we deserve a congressional declaration.
Yeah, let's do it.
All of us do.
So these guys are all corrupt. I mean, you know this. All these guys are corrupt. So think about a junior producer, though, wanting to produce oil. Let's say I came up with the Clayton Oil Company, and I go to Washington. I'm like, hey, I'm going to start to drill. Well, of course, I would be run out of town because all of the lobbyists for the big oil companies, they don't want a little junior producer popping into Washington. It's not going to happen. They're also not going to get the tax breaks and the tax incentives that Chevron, Shell, and all of these guys get. So there's really no pressure at all on United States producers at all. Nothing. But of course there is, so all of this to say, even if they did start drilling and setting up new oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico or land-based drilling, it takes 2 to 3 years, according to the data, for them to be up and running and drilling in these areas. To build a new oil platform, does not happen overnight. But these things could have been happening from the moment Biden came into office, and they weren't, right? Because instead we saw the slashing of the Keystone Pipeline, the closing of thousands of tributary pipelines, the forced sort of closure of these oil companies, the conversion away from fossil fuels towards renewables, the push in that regard. And so there's one thing that they could do, which is to stop banning Russian energy and stop the sanctions on Russian energy. That's one thing that could literally change things overnight to stop the sanctions.
Yes.
So there's almost nothing else they could do right now.
Well, besides lift the Jones Act temporarily in a case by case basis. So
these maybe sort of bureaucratic things they could do overnight, and they could get some of this fuel flowing again very quickly.
Yes. I mean, the whole, at this point, America first rallying cry makes sense if you actually do things that bring livable conditions to your people.
Right. So there's a street.
Well, they'd have to start a new campaign, so that's not going to happen. They'd have to go to saying Putin's price drop if they remove sanctions.
Putin's price drop preventing us from America first. It's catchy. Catchy.
As our health says, super chat, he says he's giving leases but no permits. That's a great point. Now they say they're giving out permits. But of course, it's interesting because they do this dance where they're saying they're giving out the permits, but they're also on the campaign trail. He was one to say, we're going to give no new permits. No new permits. They're going to have to go into solar and renewables. All of that to say is it's their fault. This is a man-made crisis. The United States is sitting on the greatest wealth of oil in the world and natural gas. But we don't have enough of it. And so, we'll tap our strategic reserves. So to tap the strategic petroleum reserves is something that Biden has been doing over the past few weeks. He's dwindled the amount of gas supplies that we have down to dangerous levels. Just take a look at this chart. This is the strategic oil reserves chart, and this is unbelievable. This goes back to the 1990s on the left side of your screen. So it's up and down a little bit, right? Up and down and up and down. Now look where it is, the far right side of your screen, all the way down. And now it turns out in the diesel strategic reserves that we have, the diesel reserves, we have about 1 million barrels left, 1 million barrels in the diesel reserve. Mm-hmm. And according to experts, that means that it could run out if we were to tap that and use that 1 million barrels. It would last us 6 hours, and then it would be gone. 6 hours.
Okay.
And this is not, and I was talking to a source this afternoon who said, Clayton, the real story isn't even this winter. The real story is next winter, because we get rid of all of these reserves, and these producers continue to not produce. And now, and Saudi Arabia and OPEC cuts their production. It's not this winter that's going to suffer. It's next winter, which is going to be catastrophic. And this winter is going to be bad enough.
Yes.
Yeah. So here, by the way, I mean, here's Biden talking about the oil industry. Do we have this soundbite?
No.
Okay. Oh, we have the Saudi prince. I want to play this because this is what the Saudi prince had to say about going into these oil reserves and how catastrophic it's going to be. And he's warning us. Watch.
It is my profound duty to make it clear to the world that losing emergency stock may become painful in the months to come.
Yes, very painful. So let us know in the chat, what are you paying right now for gas prices? What are you guys seeing? How integral is diesel into your life, driving trucks, etc., your business operations? Let us know in the chat below.